And thank you for the invitation to speak with you about faith-based targeted violence. As I was introduced, I am the convener of the Australian Hate Crime Network, but in Tasmania, we have made the decision not to use the phrase hate crime, but instead we talk about targeted violence. And that was in response to the local Palawa people who did not believe that hate was at the basis of much of the targeted violence that they experience. As with others, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I live and work, and I am absolutely blessed, as you can see in my background image, to live on the lands of the Ngayunoni people at Lunawana Alona, which is the Indigenous name for Bruny Island. Today, I did want to draw on Pastor Martin Niemuller's beautiful, beautiful statement at the end of, well, during and at the end of the Shoah and the Holocaust, because I feel that Religions for Peace specifically, but also the Australian Hate Crime Network and the Tasmanian Prejudice-Related Violence Working Group come together in allyship, recognising that alone we cannot actually make change, that it is together that we can actually create the worlds that we wish for, and particularly peaceful worlds. Today I do want to talk about hate crime or targeted violence and what it means. I want to make sure that there's a shared understanding of what these concepts are, and to talk a little bit about the unique characteristics of faith-based targeted violence before going on to allyship and bystander interventions. And as Terry knows, bystander interventions is one of my key topics, because I believe that it is only in the, well, it's not only in the one-on-one, but it is usually on the one-on-one encounters that we can have the most impact for change. So before I go on to talking about allyship and bystander intervention, I wanted to talk about what is hate crime or targeted violence. And a lot of the resources that I'm going to be drawing upon are those resources that we created for a national campaign on what is hate crime. Unfortunately, the website, which houses all of these amazing resources, is down, and that is because we are constantly sued by the far right for defamation, for actually naming up their behaviours in our materials. So if there is any additional material that you would like from us, I can provide that by email, but I can't provide you with the website, unfortunately. So hate crime or targeted violence is an act against the law. So it is a crime to start off with, and is motivated in whole or in part by bias or prejudice or hatred towards a group characteristic of the victim. We also talk about hate incidents, and these are things that do not rise to the level of something that could be investigated as a crime by the police and the criminal justice system. It is also in whole or in part motivated by bias, prejudice, or hatred. And I think it's really important to make those distinctions, because often what starts as a hate crime incident or an incident of targeted violence escalates if we don't intervene, if we don't take action, if it's not reported, or if others do not witness it. And so taking action at the bottom end, where it's an incident, possibly of hate speech or verbal abuse, may in fact avoid the hate crime that could arise from that incident. Hate crime, people can be targeted for violence, not only in terms of their faith or their religion, but also in terms of race, ethnicity, national origin, which are the common ones that most of us know, sexuality, disability, gender, age, and one that is often missed in our understandings, and that is homelessness and housing status. And it's important to also note from the outset, given that you're all coming from different places in Australia, is that those characteristics are not shared in every jurisdiction. So in our own jurisdiction, in Lutruwita, Tasmania, only racial violence is recognised by the state in its legislation. But if we go to somewhere like New South Wales, the protected categories of communities and groups and characteristics are matched by those that are represented within the Anti-Discrimination Act. So it's much broader, and it can include union membership. In some jurisdictions, such as in the US, it also includes occupations such as police officers. The other side the other thing to consider in terms of targeted violence, and often people think of the very top end of something like the Christchurch massacre in 2019, and that is often where our minds go to. But the everyday experiences of targeted violence impact individuals the moment they leave their door, or sometimes even when they're at home and online. So targeted violence can range from something like hate literature, which we're constantly dealing with in the public spaces, such as posters and stickers and graffiti, through to things such as harassment, property damage, physical and sexual assault, as well as homicide and manslaughter. In terms of targeted violence and its and who gets targeted, often it is those who are most visibly different that are targeted. And we can see this in terms of people whose skin in Australia is not white, people who have an identifiable impairment or disability, people who wear religious or ethnic clothing, couples of the same sex in public, or people who are living on the streets. Visibility is a key characteristic of who gets victimised and who is targeted. Targeted violence can affect that individual who is targeted, who is a victim. And I like to use the term victim survivor, because often we move from being a victim to a survivor of this type of violence. And we know from the research that this is not just in terms of mental well-being and self-esteem, but also that there are serious physical consequences from targeted violence, even when it is only verbal abuse. We see repeated acts of verbal abuse can result in hypertension, in serious issues with breathing and blood circulation, as well as strokes and those sorts of things. But it's not just the individual, and I think this is where targeted violence is different from other interpersonal violence, is that it also impacts the community of which that victim survivor belongs. And this is what we call the ripple effect. Often those who are targeted for violence belong to very small marginalised communities where there is only 1 or 2 degrees of separation between every member of that community. And the ripple effect out of the community from that victim survivor is quick and is immediate, and is often has a chilling effect on others from within that community. But I think more importantly for us as allies is also to recognise that targeted violence affects Australian society. It sets the standard on which we walk by, or that we stop and intervene. Individuals report feelings of depression, anxiety, anger, fear, intimidation, as well as diminished self-esteem. And targeted violence sends a message to the communities that they are unwelcome and unsafe. And this causes members of that community to modify their behaviour, to avoid certain places and people, or to develop strategies to keep themselves safe. And this hypervigilance around safety is something that came through, and I'll talk a little bit later on about our research with Muslim women, particularly who wear the hijab, the niqab or the burqa, and this hypervigilance of mapping their behaviour as soon as they make plans to leave their family home. Targeted violence, unfortunately, is underreported to the police. And even when it is reported to the police, often police do not perceive that there is increased harms with this type of violence. It is also underreported to human rights agencies like anti-discrimination boards and equal opportunity commissions. And even with those communities that have a reporting mechanism, such as the Islamophobia Register Australia or the Executive Council of Australian Jury that collects and collates targeted violence incidents, even they report that they do not get all incidents. And we saw that with our research with Islamic institutions in Australia as well. Some victim survivors are unsure whether it is worth even reporting an incident or do not trust the authorities to take the matter seriously if they do report it. And we hear over and over again that often the response is, we'll change or modify your behaviour and you won't experience that. And I think here particularly one of the most insidious forms of targeted violence actually occurs from neighbours. There is no escape from it. The moment you leave your door, your window open, it is literally there every day for you to experience. And only some forms of hate crime have been the focus of research, which makes it really difficult to know the full extent of the problem in Australia. But to give you a sense of just one community who experiences targeted violence, the LGBTIQ community, and research in the early 2000s indicated that 80% of the community knew somebody who had been physically assaulted because of their sexuality or gender. So we're talking about a really high level of community harm and a ripple effect across those communities that modify, that force some people to modify their behaviour. I think it's really important to note that all targeted violence breaches human rights and denies human dignity, and all forms of targeted violence demand a coordinated policy, law enforcement, education, and community response. Not one of those aspects of our society can resolve this problem alone, but we have to work in coordinated action. When one community is made to feel unwelcome or blocked from full participation in public life, it is a problem for all of us, which is why I started today's session and titled my session in terms of Pastor Newmala's statement about who would come for us if we do not come for others. One of the most public forms of targeted violence is that is targeting faith communities and faith institutions. And I want to talk about those two separately for the time being, because there is a range of behaviours that happen against people of faith, and usually people of faith who are visibly different from the rest of our community, but also our faith institutions become targets of violence. And Terry and our group in Tasmania did some amazing work in trying to do safety audits for some of our faith institutions. I think the Jewish community is one of the strongest in terms of securing their religious institutions, and that comes from a very long history of having their faith institutions attacked by others. It's also important to note, and this comes through in both the criminal law and the anti-discrimination cases that have been heard, is that targeted violence can be perpetrated by people of other faiths as well, or no faiths, and also within faiths. And one of the most powerful cases of anti-discrimination law is actually in relation to targeted violence directed at a Sunni population from the Shia population, but also another case from the Shia population to the Sunni population. We also see it, my colleagues in Ireland talk about the hate violence between Catholic and Protestants as well. So it's not just others that attack our communities and our faith communities, but also within our communities as well. And we need to be aware of that. As I said earlier, it is those that are most visible that are often the targets of faith-based violence. And what we see from the research is that it is Jewish men who wear the kippah or the yarmulke, Muslim women who wear the hijab, niqab or burqa, or Muslim men who wear the kufi, Hindu, Buddhist or Jain women who wear the bindi or tilak, or Sikh men who wear the turban, and of course any religious leader or worker who wears robes. And here I think particularly of our Buddhist members of our communities in Tasmania, who are often targeted because of the robes that they wear. This targeted violence is also has a temporal nature to it. It happens at times of key religious events within each of those communities, and I know that violence against Hindus increases significantly during Diwali, but also in terms of the time of the week. And we know that one of the most dangerous times of the week for both Muslims and Jews is Friday prayers, and walking to and from mosque and temple is in fact one of the most dangerous walks that both communities make each week. And it takes enormous amounts of faith and trust to even do that walk to temple or mosque. A couple of years ago, I worked with the Islamophobia Register Australia to do some research on attacks against religious institutions, Islamic institutions in Australia. And they reported that in the previous 12 months, 50% of mosques and religious institutions had experienced either criminal damage or graffiti, or the staff at those institutions had received death threats. In some instances, there was also very specific to Jewish temples and Muslim mosques, is throwing meat, particularly pig, in the buildings and the car parks, and daubing images of pigs on their institutional walls. We also see that attacks against minority religious communities also increases when there is an increase in media attention. So we know that during the quite heated debates about the building of a mosque in Bendigo resulted in enormous amounts of daily violence experienced by Muslims who lived in that town. Non-Christian religious institutions experienced increased attacks if sited predominantly in a white Anglo suburb or in a residential area, or if they had repurposed a Christian church for another faith. So there are very key characteristics to this kind of targeted violence, and it relates to, again, that visibility and the timing of events. I think it's also important to note that faith communities can also be targeted every day. And I used to live in Hobart City, right in the middle of Salamanca, and would take a walk around St David's Park each day with my dog. And it was frightening how many times the crooked cross, the Nazi cross, had been graffitied on the beautiful wall of tombs from the original cemetery that St David's Park actually was. And it was a constant process of calling the council to get it removed. And also the stickers from the far right that were almost on every single light pole as I walked to and from work. So we need to be thinking about the fact that visibility and of both our communities and visibility of the hate and the prejudice and the bias have a layering effect on the well-being of our communities. And this is why allyship is so important. And I feel like I'm in the wrong room being an atheist speaking to a group of people for Religions for Peace. But it's from my heart that I come here because I know that allyship is so important to the well-being of our communities. And Atchison talks about an ally as being somebody that actively promotes and aspires to advance a culture of inclusion. And this occurs through intentional positive and conscious efforts to benefit people as a whole. And allyship requires us to be engaged in a constant process of learning from and building cross-cultural communications and relationships with marginalised communities and people. And one of the really important characteristics and one of the meetings of the Faith Communities of Tasmania, one of the members talked to me about this other critical importance of allyship, and that is to be consistent, accountable, and trustworthy. That you can't be a fair-weathered friend, that you're only there for the moments that meet your needs, but also to be there in those difficult moments. And often I talk about being an ally is not about you. It is not about you as a person or as a member of a community. And it's not about a public display of benevolence or charity to the other. You don't have all the answers, and it's not about centering your views. It's about leading by following the communities you seek to support and to be actively listening to what they're saying. So allyship requires a match between words and actions, to walk the talk. And allyship requires us to lift up others by advocating and sharing growth opportunities with others, to make space for others to speak. And I often see this in our hate crime meetings, where the loudest voice gets heard first and often, and we often do not give space to have silence and to allow others who may not feel safe to speak immediately to step into that space. So sharing those growth opportunities with others is really important. It's also about recognising that you may do wrong, but you may do better next time. And so not viewing the other's fear, anger, distrust as a personal attack, but as something that is a safety mechanism, a protection around us, so that we get to test you out before we know whether it's safe. Allyship also requires us to recognise that the experiences of our communities is not individual, it is in fact systemic. And systemic inequalities underpin a lot of the targeted violence that is experienced. And it doesn't need to be extreme violence, but also microaggressions that tell us whether we are safe, that we are included, and that we belong. Allyship also requires us to believe what the other has to tell us and not judge it based on our own experiences. We are all experts in our own lived experience, and opening and being open to hearing other stories is really important. And of course, all of this requires self-reflection. If we cannot reflect on our own behaviours and our own actions, then we cannot change, and we cannot expect others to change. So Purna Luthra suggests that allyship requires a shift in our standpoint, a shift in our perspective. And you know, if we think about the old adage of walking in the other's shoes just to get a sense of what it's like to be in their worlds. And this deliberate standpoint is required to enliven a deep curiosity about the other, a deep curiosity about their lives, their perspectives, their attitudes, their beliefs, which then in turn requires an honest introspection about our own ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and bringing to those encounters a humble acknowledgement that we do have different experiences, and that the other's experience is no less than ours just because it is different. It also requires an empathy, a true empathy with the other, even if we do not share those lived experiences, to be open to hearing things that may make us feel uncomfortable, may make us feel vulnerable, and and feeling uncomfortable about what to say or not to say or how to say it. And it requires authentic conversations. It's not just about the brush off of, hi, how are you, move along. It's actually asking about where they're at that time. And this also, of course, requires courageous responsibilities from us as bystanders, of us being able to step into that space and to be able to take action, whether it is just to recognise the other and to make sure that they recognise that you see them. Bystanders have such an important role in supporting marginalised faith communities. Bystanders, by their very nature, are not the targets of the violence or discrimination. They have a certain level of privilege that will allow them to step into that space. And I think particularly of some of the cases that were reported to us when we were looking at Islamophobic violence, where so often the violence occurred against Muslim women, again, who are visibly Muslim because of their clothing, often with young children in public places where there are crowds that literally stand around and watch the violence occur without intervening. And one of our participants in our research talked about the simple act of one person coming up and putting their hand on her shoulder was all that was required for her to feel that there was somebody, if it escalated much further, there was somebody that could intervene. So speaking from a standpoint of an ally can have a significant effect on other people's behaviours. It is not something that I expect you to take lightly. Sometimes, as we've seen a couple of weeks ago, that being a bystander that intervenes can actually make you the target of violence. And there was just an awful situation a couple of weeks ago where the person that tried to intervene was actually attacked and resulted in a serious assault. But it should not be the person from a marginalised faith that does the hard work of changing attitudes. That's all of our work. We need to hear and listen to them, actively listen to their stories, but we also need to be stepping into that space. And even though intervention can sometimes be dangerous if the bystander does not understand the power and the context of that violence, we can also be passive bystanders by simply recording the event on our phones. Something so simple as recording an event gives the victim, survivor, evidence that something happened, proof that something happened. And we hear so often from victims and survivors saying, you know, afterwards I couldn't believe that it happened, and maybe I thought that it happened and it didn't happen. So being able to have just a passive victim, a passive bystander recording the event means that there is a record, but also sometimes somebody physically, visibly recording something often it de-escalates the perpetrator of violence, and they walk away because of that fear of being recognised. But we can also be active bystanders safely. And one of the most powerful ways in which to do that is to sit and stand beside the victim, to intervene just by simply being present. A colleague who is a little person said one of the best forms of bystander intervention is to come up as a stranger and ask the victim survivor, do you know where the next train station is, or the bus station, or do you know where this shop is, or where this church is? Because that simple task of asking or intervening and asking that victim survivor actually breaks that dynamic between the perpetrator and the victim, and it allows the victim to say, oh, I don't know what the street name is, but I can walk you there, and literally you can walk away with that victim survivor. So there is a lot of ways in which we can intervene and to change the situation for victims. And there's what we call the 5 Ds, the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. Direct, delegate, distract, delay, and document. And I'll just go through quickly each of those. Direct is to call out the issue safely. And we see this often in public transport, where somebody is being targeted by perpetrators and somebody else just yells out, hey, that's not okay, stop that. Just something as simple as verbally saying something to try and stop something to happen. We delegate, we enlist others, that we talk to the crowd surrounding the victim and perpetrator and tell them, this is not okay, and get them to buy in to making a change as well. Distract, of course, I've already told you about a distract. Just ask where the next shop is or bus station is. Delay, you may not be able to do something right there and then, but after the incident, coming up to that victim survivor and asking if they're okay, if they need assistance, if they want us to call the police or call family or call somebody to give them assistance. And document, record it, even if it's just a little note in your phone or in your notebook that this is what you saw on this date at this time, because it may be critically important to the outcome of that incident. So allyship is really critical, and bystander intervention is really important. We need to learn how to do it, to feel safe in doing it, and to recognise that we are always going to be uncomfortable doing it. But targeted violence is not inevitable. And I think Religions for Peace is a case study in allyship and bystander intervention. But your work should not end in allyship with other faith communities. Targeted violence affects others based on race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, disability, housing status. And members of your religious communities would likely have intersectional experiences across those characteristics, and you never know who else is in the room. Legislation is important, and I work with Terry and others in Tasmania to try and change our legislation so that all forms of targeted violence is recognised in law. But rarely does legislation change minds, even if it may impact on public behaviour. Everyday conversations such as those that I hope that we share tonight are just as powerful as laws. And I thank you for your time today in sharing this knowledge.